The Arizona Territory in 1876 did not smell of perfume. It smelled of iron dust, baking creosote, and human sweat in Laurel Creek. The primary scent was the railroad itself. It was the thick, greasy odor of progress, the smell of money being hammered into the earth, spike by spike. The sound was the town's heartbeat, a relentless, metallic pulse that started before the sun and ended long after it. It was the clang of the sledge on the spikehead, the deep grunt of the Gandhi dancers, the shrill whistle of the foreman, and the groan of the supply wagons. Clara Hart knew the sound better than her own breathing. At 23 years old, she was already a widow, bound to the cookhouse of the Burke Rail and Mining Company. She was paying off the debts of a dead blacksmith, a man who had also known iron. He had known its heat, its temper, and in the end, its terrible, final weight. Now, Clara knew only the heat of the massive, cast-iron wood stove, a black beast that demanded feeding from before 4 o'clock in the morning until long after the last exhausted laborer had eaten. She was a cook's assistant. This meant she did the work the head cook, a grumpy man named Silas, deemed beneath him. She hauled water from the company well, her shoulders aching. She scrubbed the long plank tables until the wood grain showed clean. She peeled potatoes and onions until her hands were raw and stained. And she kept the coffee pot, a behemoth that held 5 gallons, perpetually full of thick, bitter brew that the men drank like water. Her world was this tent, a long canvas structure stained with soot and grease. The cookhouse was the only place in Laurel Creek that felt like an oasis. It was an island of dependable warmth against the high desert cold, which fell sharp as an axe blade the moment the sun vanished behind the mesas. The men who worked the line, Irishmen and Swedes, freedmen and Chinese, they lived in a rough camp of tents and lean-tos. They were ruled by the iron. The railroad tracks, stretching east into the known world and west into the unknown, were the symbol of power. They were cold, absolute, and imposed upon the land. Clara's fire, however, was life. It was sustenance. Men came to her stove broken, tired, and covered in the filth of their labor. They left with hot biscuits and bacon, their bellies full, their spirits marginally restored, ready to face the iron again. She served them, her face passive, her eyes missing nothing. She hid her past, not with the lies, but with a profound and steady silence. She had learned that in a place like Laurel Creek, a woman alone was safest when she was invisible. The canvas flaps of the cookhouse parted, letting in a swirl of alkali dust and the man who wore the town's law like a poorly fitting coat. Sheriff Tom Pike did not duck. He forced the canvas aside as if it had insulted him, his spurs ringing on the hard-packed dirt floor. He was a large man, his gut pushed hard against a silver belt buckle, his face sunburned raw beneath the brim of a stained hat. He worked for Burke Rail and Mining, though his badge, pinned crookedly to his vest, claimed he worked for the territory. Everyone knew who paid his wages, and it was not the taxpayers. "Coffee, woman!" he boomed. He did not ask. He never asked. Clara moved without looking directly at his face. It was safer not to meet his eyes. She fetched the heavy pot, her arm straining slightly with the weight, and filled the thick mug he slapped down on the counter. He took a long, noisy swallow, his throat working. "Damn swill," he announced. Yet he held the mug out for more. A foreman, Mr. Gideon, sat at the end table, wolfing down beans and side pork. He was one of the few men allowed to eat inside, away from the main mess. "Any trouble last night?" Sheriff Gideon asked, his mouth full. Pike spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the floor. Clara flinched, her hands tightening on the pot handle. It was another mess she would have to clean, another small humiliation to be swallowed. "Trouble's always breathing out here," Pike said, his voice full of gravel and self-importance. "Heard from the surveyors up near the pass. They claim they are missing supplies again. Tents slashed, 2 mules gone." Gideon grunted, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. Apache. It is always the Apache, Pike said, his voice loud with a certainty that filled the tent. Burke wants it handled. He does not pay us to lose equipment to savages. He wants that line built by October, and by God, we will build it. What will you do? Gideon asked, leaning forward. Ride out, rattle their cages, show them who the law belongs to. Pike smiled, a pulling of dry lips over yellowed teeth. It was not a pleasant sight. The law belongs to the man strong enough to enforce it, and Mr. Silas Burke, he is a very strong man. Clara turned back to the stove, the intense heat on her face a welcome shield. She had heard this talk before, almost every week. Everything that went wrong was the fault of the natives. A missing horse, a dry well, a bad hand of cards. The line between the railroad crews and the small, displaced bands of Apache that lived in the high canyons was fragile. It was a thing stretched thin by suspicion, old blood, and the relentless noise of the hammers. Pike and his deputies, fueled by company whiskey and company orders, were always eager to be the ones to tear it completely. She thought of the word justice. It felt thin here, thin and brittle as sun-baked alkali flat. Justice was just a word men like Pike used to justify their action. Dignity and freedom were luxuries this town could not afford. Here, there was only the railroad, and the men who served it, and the men who died for it. Miles away, where the sound of the hammers was only a faint, metallic echo carried on the wind. Niall moved through the scrub oak. He was a warrior, but he had left the path of vengeance 5 winters ago. Revenge was a fire that consumed the man who held it, and he had seen too many good men burn down to ash. Now, he hunted. He provided for his kin. A small group led by his grandmother's sister, Nalin. She had seen too much change and wanted only peace in her old age. He tracked a mule deer, his moccasins making no sound on the rocky soil. His skill was not in war, it was in the earth. He read the land as Clara read the moods of the cookhouse. He saw the bent grass, the tiny scuff of a hoof on stone, the subtle shift in the wind that meant water was near. He spoke little English, just enough words to trade, just enough to understand the threats of the white men who swarmed the land. He had seen the railroad. He watched it often from the high ridges, a long black snake cutting the world in two. It was loud, it scared the game. It brought men like Pike, men who shot first and asked questions of the corpses. His duty was to his family, to keep them safe, to keep them fed. This meant venturing near Laurel Creek, a place he hated, a place that smelled of rust and bad spirits. To trade the deer he now tracked for the flour and salt his people needed. The market at Laurel Creek was not a market. It was 2 canvas tents and a set of rusted scales run by a nervous, twitchy man named Elias, who owned the dry goods store. Clara was there, her list from Silas clutched tightly in her hand. She needed beans, 20 pounds of them, and more lard. She saw him as she waited for Ellis to finish with a prospector, Neil. He stood apart from the few off-duty railroad men who loitered nearby. He was quiet. He carried the carcass of a young buck draped over his shoulders. The weight settled easily, a testament to his strength. He did not look at the other men. He looked only at the goods stacked on Elias's table. He laid the meat down. Elias looked nervous, his eyes darting to the sheriff's office across the dusty, wide street. Dealing with the Apache was tolerated, but not encouraged. Flour, Neil said. The one word was quiet. Clear. Elias nodded quickly, his hands fluttering as he weighed out a large sack. The trade was made. Neil lifted the heavy sack as if it were feathers and turned to leave, his movements fluid and economical. As he turned, the knife at his belt, sheathed in worn, dark leather, caught the corner of the plank table. The sheath tilted, and the knife, a heavy, practical blade worn smooth with use, slipped free. It fell to the dust of the street with a soft, solid thud. Neil did not immediately notice. He took 2 steps before some deep instinct made him stop, his hand dropping to his hip. Clara saw it. The railroad men saw it too. One of them, a big man with shoulders like a bull, snickered. "Look at that! The savage lost his sticker." Clara moved before she thought. The men expected her to be afraid, to shrink back into the canvas shadows. She was a widow, a cook's assistant. She was supposed to be invisible. She bent down, her calico skirt brushing the filth of the street. She picked up the knife. It was heavy in her hand, the handle wrapped tight in sinew. The balance perfect. It was a tool she recognized instantly, not just a weapon. It was a tool for skinning, for cutting, for living. It reminded her of her husband's favorite hammer. She stepped forward, into the sunlight. The railroad men tensed, their laughter dying. Neol turned fully. His eyes met hers. He was wary, his body coiled. He expected a trick, an insult, a shout for the sheriff. Clara held the knife out to him. She offered it hilt first. She offered it as she would offer a ladle of soup or a slice of bread. A simple, necessary thing. Their fingers did not touch. He took the knife from her. His gaze held hers for a long second, longer than was comfortable. It was not a gaze of gratitude. Not exactly. It was a gaze of sharp, sudden recognition. He saw her. In that moment, she was not just a white woman, not just part of the noise and the iron. He saw a person. "He dropped this," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm, speaking to the air, or perhaps to the other men who watched, frozen. Neol nodded once. It was a short, sharp gesture. He secured the knife in its sheath, his fingers testing the fit. He looked at her one more time, a brief, assessing glance that took in her worn dress, her clean hands, and the steadiness in her eyes. Then, without a single word, he was gone. He did not walk away. He melted back into the alleys between the tents, heading for the freedom of the high ground, leaving only silence behind him. Clara turned back to Elias, her heart beating a little faster than normal. The silence in the market was heavy, charged. The railroad man who had snickered was now quiet, looking at her with a strange mix of confusion and new respect. She was not the woman they thought she was. She got the beans and the lard. She walked back to the cookhouse, the sounds of the hammers rising to meet her, pulling her back into her world, the iron rhythm, clang, clang, clang. She stoked the fire, the physical act grounding her. The heat on her face was real. The glance in the street was real. The deep, casual hatred in Pike's voice was real. She lived between these things, balanced on a thin line. She thought of the knife, a tool for survival. Her stove was her tool. The railroad was Burke's tool. And men like Pike, they were tools too, just of a different, cruder sort. The cookhouse was her small territory, her island of warmth in the cold, encroaching power of the rails. She looked at the fire, its orange light dancing on the soot-stained canvas. Then she looked out the tent flap, at the 2 parallel lines of steel that ran disappearing into the horizon, cutting the desert, promising a future that cared little for the past. She wondered who, in this land of strong men and loud hammers, would be left to speak for those who had no voice. The question settled inside her, heavy as the iron pot she lifted onto the flames. The shot came just after midnight. It was a single, flat crack that ripped the cold silence, followed by a heavy shout, then mayhem. In Laurel Creek, the only thing worse than the sound of the hammers was the sound of them stopping. Clara, pulling a fresh batch of sourdough loaves from the lower oven, froze. The silence that followed the shot was heavy, unnatural. The night shift on the line had ceased. Men spilled from their tents, lanterns swinging, casting wild, drunken shadows on the canvas walls. They converged on the west end of the camp, where the Burke Rail and Mining Supply Depot stood. It was a massive tent, reinforced with timber, holding everything from flour and bacon to blasting powder and new steel spikes. When Clara arrived, pulling her shawl tight against the biting air, the scene was already set. The canvas flap of the depot had been slashed open, the heavy lock hanging useless. Inside, chaos. Sacks of flour were ripped open, their contents white powder on the dark earth. A keg of black powder was missing. Crates of tools were overturned. Sheriff Tom Pike stood in the middle of the mess, his face purple with rage in the lantern light. Silas Burke was there too, the owner of the line. Burke was a quiet man, dressed in a clean suit that seemed impossible to maintain in the desert. He was calm, which was always more frightening than Pike's bluster. "It is Apache," Pike declared, his voice ringing out for all to hear. He had not looked for tracks. He had not asked questions. He simply knew. This is their work, slashing, stealing. They are testing us. They are seeing what they can get away with. Burke nodded slowly, his cold eyes sweeping over the gathered laborers. "Sheriff Pike is right. This is an attack on our progress, an attack on our very livelihood. We cannot allow this. We will not allow this." A murmur went through the crowd. It was the sound of fear mixing with anger. These men were tired, overworked, and paid little. They needed an enemy, a physical thing to blame for their misery. Pike and Burke had just given them one. "I am doubling the guard," Burke announced, "and I'm authorizing Sheriff Pike to form a posse. He will take whatever men he needs." "We ride at dawn," Pike shouted, slapping his pistol grip. "We will show those savages what happens when they steal from this company." Clara slipped away, the anger in the air making her stomach sour. She returned to the cookhouse. The bread was cooling, its warm, yeasty smell, a contradiction to the cold violence brewing outside. She felt the heavy, familiar weight of injustice settle on her. It felt too easy, too practiced. She worked through the rest of the night, her mind racing. The men would need a full breakfast before they rode out to hunt people. She needed another batch of dough, her movements mechanical, forceful. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the cookhouse was once again an island of light, the only light that promised food instead of a fight. The rumors began with the first pot of coffee. The gossip flew thick as the grease smoke from the bacon. "I heard they scalped the guard," one man whispered, his eyes wide. "They did not," another countered. "But they slit his throat. He is barely clinging to life." "It was a whole war party," a third man insisted. "At least 20 braves. They took 3 rifles and all the blasting powder." Clara served the bacon and biscuits, her face a mask of neutrality. She listened. The story grew with every telling. The missing keg of powder became 10 kegs. The slashed tent became a burned-out wagon. By the time the sun lit the eastern mesas, the camp was convinced a full-scale Apache uprising was imminent. The guard who had supposedly been scalped, a lazy man named Hutch, was sitting at the back table, eating with a healthy appetite, loudly complaining that he could have been killed. Clara kept working. The posse, drunk on coffee and righteousness, thundered out of camp just after 6 o'clock, led by Pike. Their shouts echoed back, swallowed by the vast, indifferent desert. Clara's day was long and heavy. The tension did not leave with the posse. It settled over the camp, thick and suffocating. The men left behind to work the line were jumpy, their hammers missing strikes, their curses sharper. That evening, exhausted. Clara was cleaning the grease trap, the day's most foul job, when Silas, the head cook, grunted at her. "We are low on beans, and the sourdough starter is running thin. Need more flour from the main store." Clara sighed. "The main depot is a mess." "Not the depot, the back store, the canvas pantry behind this tent. We keep overflow there." He tossed her a ring of keys. "And be quick. I want to close up. The men are spooked." The back pantry was a small tent, barely tall enough to stand in, connected to the main cookhouse by a covered canvas walkway. It smelled of burlap, dried beans, and mice. A single lantern hung from the center pole. Clara found the bean sacks. As she was counting them, her foot kicked something hard on the dirt floor, half hidden under a fold of loose canvas. It was not a rock. She bent down, pushing the canvas aside. It was a railroad spike. But it was not a normal spike. Normal spikes were rough, functional. This one was different. The head was marked with a small, deeply stamped M inside a circle. She recognized it instantly. It was one of her husband's old maker's marks, from a special set of bridge ties he had forged for a different company 2 years ago. Before Burke had bought out the contract, Burke Rail and Mining used a different spike, a standard B. She stared at it. What was a bridge spike from 2 years ago doing here, dropped in the dirt of the pantry? She remembered the rumors about Burke buying out the competition, the mysterious accidents that had plagued the other company. She heard voices. They came from outside, from the narrow, dark alley between the cookhouse and the supply depot. She froze, her hand closing around the cool, heavy steel of the spike. She instinctively doused the lantern, plunging the pantry into near total darkness. "You are a fool." "Hutch," a voice whispered, harsh and low. It was Milo, the other night guard. "You almost dropped the whole sack right by the cookhouse. What if she'd seen—" Clara's blood ran cold. "Hutch, the guard who claimed he was almost killed." "She did not see," Hutch's voice, equally low, growled back. "I moved it. And what if I did drop one spike? It is just one. We got the rest, the powder and the good flour. Sold it all to the silver crew up on the mountain. Easy money. I tell you, easiest I ever made. But Pike," Milo fretted, his voice shaking. "He took a posse. He is hunting Apache. He's going to kill someone." Hutch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "That is the best part, you idiot. Pike gets to be a big man. Burke gets his excuse to clear the Apache off that pass, and we get the silver. Everybody gets what they want. Now shut up. I am going to the saloon." Clara stood in the darkness, her knuckles white as she gripped the marked spike. She did not breathe. She heard their footsteps fade, the crunch of boots on gravel. She knew. The theft was an inside job. Hutch and Milo. They stole the supplies, sold them, and let the Apache take the blame. And Burke, he was letting it happen. He wanted it to happen. The posse was not justice. It was an extermination, sanctioned by a lie. The spike in her hand felt heavy as a condemnation. If she spoke, what would happen? Hutch and Milo would deny it. They were company men. She was just a cook's assistant, a widow in debt. They would silence her. A woman alone vanishing in the desert was not a rare thing. She would lose her job, her small shelter. She would be thrown out, or worse. If she said nothing, the posse would ride on. They would find Neil's people, or some other band. They would shoot and burn and call it law. Innocent people would die because she was a coward. She looked down at the spike. It was a key to the entire lie, but it was a key she could not use. The next morning, the camp was subdued. The posse had not returned. Clara felt as though she were moving through water. Every man she served, every cup of coffee she poured, felt like a betrayal. The camp well was running low, the water thick with mud from the bottom. Silas cursed. "This water is filth. It will ruin the coffee. Go to the creek. Clara, take the buckets. Get the clean water." Clara's heart jumped. The creek. It was a mile from the camp, hidden by cottonwoods. It was quiet, isolated, and, she realized with a jolt, it was in the same direction the posse had ridden. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Safer than drinking this sludge." Silas snapped. "Pike's bunch scared off everything breathing within 10 miles. Go!" She took the 2 wooden buckets, their weight familiar on her arms. The walk was quiet. The hammer blows of the railroad faded behind her, replaced by the buzz of insects and the cry of a distant hawk. The air was clear. and the silence felt good. A relief from the tense, rumor-filled cookhouse. She reached the line of green trees that marked the water. She pushed through the willows to the bank, where the water ran clear and shallow over smooth stones. She saw him immediately. He was 20 yards upstream, half hidden in the shadow of a large granite boulder. It was Neil. He was not hunting. He was leaning heavily against the rock, his face pale beneath his dark skin, his jaw set in a rigid line. His left shoulder was dark, stained with something wet, blood. Clara stopped. He saw her at the same time. His right hand, fast as a snake, grabbed the hilt of the knife she had returned to him. His eyes were narrowed, full of pain and fierce warning. She set the buckets down slowly, her hands raised slightly, palms out. "I am here for water," she said. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet grove. He did not relax. He watched her, breathing in short, sharp hisses through his teeth. She saw the wound clearly now. It was not a clean hole. A bullet had torn a long, raw graze across the muscle of his shoulder, ripping his buckskin shirt and the flesh beneath. It was bleeding sluggishly. "The posse," she stated. It was not a question. He nodded, a tight, pained jerk of his head. "They ride fast. Shoot at shadows." He had been ambushed, shot without cause, simply for being who he was, in the wrong place. The rage she had felt in the pantry last night returned, cold and sharp. "That is a bad wound," she said, taking a step closer. His knife lifted slightly. "Stay." She stopped. "It needs pressure. You will bleed out or the fever will take you." She knew about wounds. She had tended Robert after the forge accident, a terrible burn that had become infected. She had learned from the old doctor what to look for, how to clean, how to bind. "You must stop the bleeding," she said again, her voice low and calm. "You are pressing the wrong place." He glanced down at his own hand, which was cupped over the top of the wound. Blood seeping. "It is not deep," he lied, his voice tight. "It is wide," she countered. "And it is dirty. It needs to be pressed, hard, or you will lose the arm." He glared at her, weighing his options. He was weak. He was trapped. She was a white woman from the railroad camp, his enemy. Clara sighed and tore a long, clean strip from the hem of her underskirt. It was the only clean cloth she had. She held it out. "Here, it is clean." He stared at the white cloth. Then his eyes lifted to her face. "I will not hurt you," she said. "I am a cook, not a killer." Slowly, his hand eased on the knife. He was losing blood, his body starting to shake slightly from the shock. Clara moved forward, slowly, as if approaching a wild horse. "I must press it. I will not make it worse." As she knelt beside him, she saw the small, beaded leather pouch he wore on a thong around his neck. It rested on his collarbone, dark with his sweat. It was his medicine. She knew, a sacred thing. Her husband had carried a small iron charm, and he had hated anyone touching it. She stopped her hand, her fingers inches from his skin. She looked him in the eye. "I will not touch your medicine." His head snapped up, his eyes clouded with pain, sharpened with surprise. He had expected her to be clumsy, to grab, to disrespect. She held the wadded cloth out to him, not touching his skin. "You place this. I will put my hands over yours. I will push. It will hurt." A flicker of something not trust, but understanding passed over his face. He took the cloth from her. His hand was shaking as he placed it over the raw graze. Clara put both her hands over his, lacing her fingers with his for grip. Then she leaned in, putting her shoulder and all her weight into the pressure, shoving the cloth down hard onto the wound. Neil let out a sharp grunt, his whole body going rigid, his eyes squeezed shut. He gripped her hands, his fingers like steel traps, but he did not pull away. They stayed that way for a full minute, frozen. She could feel the heat of his skin, the tremor of his muscles. She smelled his sweat, the copper scent of his blood, and the faint, dusty smell of the desert sage that clung to his clothes. Finally, she eased the pressure, just slightly. The bleeding had slowed to a dark ooze. "It will hold," she said, her voice rough. "But you must have it bound, and you must leave. They may come back." He opened his eyes. He looked at her hands, still covering his. Then he looked at her face. He let go of her hands and pulled the cloth tighter, wincing. "You did not scream," he said, his English slow. "There was no one to hear," she replied, sitting back on her heels. "And I did not want them to come." He nodded, as if that made sense. He looked at her buckets. "The creek is not safe. The posse, they are watching the trails. I must get the water." "I will watch," he said, pushing himself up the rock, his good hand taking his weight. "You did not call them?" "It was not their bullet to shoot," she said simply. He looked at her for a long, heavy moment. "The market, the store, you trade. The trail you use is watched. I know a better way. A shortcut, through the rocks." "You would show me." "You returned my knife," he said. "You did not touch the pouch. You stopped the blood. I show you the safe way." It was a bargain, an exchange. "Wait here," he said. He disappeared into the willows, silent as smoke. Clara filled her buckets, her arms shaking from adrenaline. Not the weight. The walk back to the cookhouse felt different, charged. She did not see him, but she knew he was there, somewhere in the rocks above, watching her. When she returned, the cookhouse was buzzing again. Pike and his posse were back. They were empty-handed, tired and angry. They scattered. Pike was booming, slamming his empty mug on the table. Clara moved to refill it. "Vanished, like smoke, but we will find them. Burke has given the word. We will build that line, even if we have to build it over their graves." The men cheered, a low, ugly sound. Pike squinted at Clara as she poured his coffee. "You were gone a long time, woman. Where were you?" "The creek," Clara said, her voice steady. The lie came easier than she expected. "The water's low. It took time to fill the buckets." "You see anything out there, any sign?" She felt the weight of the marked spike in her apron pocket. She thought of the raw wound on Niall's shoulder. She thought of Hutch, laughing in the alleyway. "No, Sheriff," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "I saw nothing, just dust and a thirsty land." The dust of Pike's failure settled, but the anger did not. It festered. Within a day, a new notice was nailed to the door of the saloon, the fresh pine planks of the makeshift jail, and the main post of the company store. It was printed in thick, black letters, stark and brutal. "Wanted. Apache. Dead or alive. $50. The words hung in the air, a declaration of open war. $50 was 3 months' wages for a Gandhi dancer. It was enough money to make a man forget his conscience, or to invent one he did not have. The camp, already tense, now buzzed with a greedy, nervous energy. Men looked at the hills with new eyes, not as a landscape, but as a coffer waiting to be unlocked with a bullet. Silas Burke himself paid a visit to the cookhouse. He arrived just as Clara was serving the noon meal. The long tables crowded with men gulping down beans and salt pork. He did not eat. He stood by the tent flap, his clean suit an accusation against the grime of the camp. He waited until she was wiping down the cutting board. "Mistress Hart," he said, his voice quiet, yet it cut through the din of scraping tin plates. Clara turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Burke." His eyes were pale blue, the color of a winter sky. They held no warmth. "Sheriff Pike is organizing a permanent volunteer patrol. A new one. Better equipped, they will need special provisions. dried beef, hardtack, full canteens. They will be leaving and returning at all hours. "I will have the coffee ready," she said, her voice flat. "You will do more than that," he said. He took a step closer, and the men nearest them quieted, pretending not to listen. "You will ensure they have the best. They are doing the hard work of protecting this camp, protecting our investment, protecting you." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "We need to know that everyone in this camp is loyal, Mistress Hart, that everyone understands the threat. Your cooperation is vital." It was not a request, it was an order, wrapped in a threat. She was being conscripted. Her stove, her oasis, was now an official armory for a hunting party. She was to feed the men who were going to collect $50 for a dead man. "I understand," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I am sure you do," he replied. He turned and left, leaving a cold pocket of air where he had stood. The true message arrived 2 hours later. It was not delivered by Burke. It was brought by a thin, nervous man from the company's accounting tent. He handed her a sealed envelope, avoided her eyes, and scurried away. Clara wiped the grease from her hands before she broke the wax seal. It was not a long letter. It was on thick company stationery, addressed to the estate of Robert Hart. It spoke of her late husband's debts, the ones she was working to pay off. It noted the recent unrest and the instability of the territory. Because of this, the letter continued. The Burke Rail and Mining Company was forced to review all outstanding accounts. The last paragraph was simple. "We trust that all company employees, and those beholden to the company, will show their full and undivided cooperation during this difficult time. Any action deemed to be unhelpful or seen as assisting the wrong people would demonstrate a poor faith that would compel us to call in the entirety of the debt, immediately." She read it twice. The paper shook in her hand. This was the true tightening of the noose. It was not just her job. It was her life. They owned her. If she stepped out of the line, if she was even suspected of helping the wrong people, she would be destitute, thrown out of the camp with nothing, carrying a debt she could never repay. The marked railroad spike, hidden beneath her thin mattress, felt heavier than a blacksmith's hammer. She had to get out, to breathe air that was not thick with lies and bacon grease. She took her meager basket and went to Elias's dry goods store, using the excuse of needing salt. The small, cluttered store was the closest thing Laurel Creek had to a public square. Today, it was the site of a quiet, tense debate. Reverend Miller, a tall, gaunt man who preached to a congregation of 3 families and a dozen railroad men on Sundays, was speaking to Elias, the store owner. "A bounty, Eliam," the Reverend was saying, his voice full of a weary sadness. "Dead or alive, that is not law. That is an invitation to murder. We are supposed to be building a civilization here, not a butcher's block." Elias, who had looked nervous ever since the knife incident, wrung his hands. "But Reverend, the depot was attacked. The men are scared. Mr. Burke has to protect his property. We all have to be safe." "Safe," the Reverend scoffed, adjusting his worn spectacles. "Is it safety we build with Pike's posse?" He returned with empty hands and a thirst for blood. "Has anyone investigated this theft? Has anyone asked for proof we are blaming an entire people for a crime we did not see?" Clara stood by the pickle barrel, her basket clutched to her stomach. She held the proof. She held the marked spike. She knew who the thieves were. She knew Hutch and Milo were, at that very moment, boasting in the saloon, their pockets heavier. "Mistress Hart," Elias said, turning to her with relief, desperate for a new topic. "You are quiet today. All this, it must be frightening. You all alone in that cookhouse so late." Clara felt the Reverend's sharp, intelligent gaze fall on her. He saw too much. "I am just here for salt, Elias," she managed to say. Her voice sounded thin. She could not meet the Reverend's eyes. To speak would be to sign her own death warrant, or at least her expulsion. The letter from Burke was a chain around her throat. She paid for the salt and fled, the Reverend's disappointed gaze following her out the door. She returned to the cookhouse. The place felt like a cage. She went to the woodpile at the back of the tent, the place where she often sat for a moment's peace, to get wood for the evening fire. Tucked in a crevice between two logs was a small object. It was a deer-hide pouch, no bigger than her thumb, tied with a sinew cord. It was not the pouch Niall wore. It was another. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that it was from him. He must have used the shortcut, the one he had shown her, to leave it. She opened it. Inside was not a charm, but a pinch of dried, dark green herbs and a small piece of dried root. It smelled strong, of pine and damp earth and something else, something sharp and clean. She did not understand until she looked at her own arm. A long, red burn, fresh from that morning, marked her forearm where she had grazed the oven door. It was a common injury for her. He must have seen her burns at the creek. He was repaying her. She had given him a clean cloth. He was giving her medicine. It was an act of profound, startling trust. He was giving her a piece of his knowledge, of his world, a world that men like Pike wanted to extinguish for $50. She closed her hand around the small pouch, the herbs crushing slightly, releasing their scent. It was a connection, a secret shared. It made the lies of the camp seem even more foul. Night fell. The saloon was loud. The men inside fueled by bounty talk and Burke's whiskey. The camp was on edge. Clara was scrubbing the great stew pot, her back aching, her mind a whirl of debts, spikes, and herbs. The sound was not a gunshot. It was a shout, and then a whoosh, like a giant's breath. Fire, fire. The cookhouse is on fire. Clara spun around. The entire back wall of the tent, the canvas near the pantry, was a sheet of orange flame. She grabbed the nearest water bucket and threw it, but the water turned to steam, having no effect. The fire, fed by the grease-soaked canvas and the dry desert wind, exploded. Smoke, thick and black, filled the tent in seconds. "Get out!" she screamed to Silas, the head cook, who was frozen in disbelief. She shoved him toward the front flap and scrambled out after him, coughing, her eyes stinging. The night air was filled with shouts and running men. The cookhouse, her only home, was being eaten alive by the flames. Then she froze. Her heart stopped. "Manuel," she whispered. She had seen him not an hour before. Manuel, the 6-year-old son of one of the Mexican laundresses. A quiet, quick boy who sometimes darted into the pantry to steal a biscuit or a dried apple, hiding from the bigger, rougher railroad children. He often curled up behind the flour sacks to sleep, where it was warm. "He is in there," she screamed, turning back to the inferno. "There is a boy in the pantry." 2 men grabbed her. "It is too late, woman. The whole thing is going." "No, Manuel, he is in there." She fought them, her fists beating against their chests. She was frantic. She looked at the wall of fire and saw only the small, dark-eyed boy. She broke free. She ran to the horse trough, plunging a heavy burlap sack into the water. She wrapped the dripping, heavy thing around her head and shoulders, took one last breath of clean air, and ran straight back into the burning tent. It was a hell of smoke and roaring heat. She could not see. She could only feel. The main tent pole was groaning, sparks raining down. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling toward where the pantry had been. The smoke was so thick she could not breathe. It was like swallowing hot ash. "Manuel!" she choked. She heard it, a high, thin wail of terror. He was there, huddled behind a stack of bean sacks that were just beginning to smolder. He was paralyzed, his face streaked with tears and soot. "Come!" she yelled, grabbing his arm. She pulled him to her, wrapping him inside the wet sack with her. "Hold on, do not let go." She dragged him, crawling back the way she came, her lungs on fire. She followed the only patch of air, low on the ground. She saw the opening of the tent, a pale rectangle in the blackness, with a final, agonizing push. She shoved the boy out onto the dirt and collapsed after him. Just as the main tent pole snapped, the entire structure fell in on itself with a sound like a dragon's roar, sending a volcano of sparks into the night sky. Clara lay on the ground, gasping, her throat raw. Manuel was sobbing, but he was alive. His mother ran to him, scooping him up, screaming his name, covering him in kisses, her Spanish prayers a torrent of gratitude. The camp gathered, their faces grim in the flickering light of the dying fire. Clara pushed herself to a sitting position. Her hair was singed, her hands and face burned. The crowd parted. Sheriff Tom Pike strode into the circle, his face a mask of thunder. He surveyed the smoking ruins of the cookhouse. His gaze fell on Clara, then on the weeping mother and her child. Just then, one of his deputies pointed to a figure stumbling away from the saloon, a drunk railroad guard, his clothes smelling of whiskey. Pike ignored him. He looked at the crowd. "Apache tactics," he boomed, his voice silencing everyone. "This is what they do. They try to burn us out. They try to starve us. They see our strength, and they attack our weakest point, our food, our women." Clara looked up, her vision swimming. She saw the drunk guard being helped away. She knew the fire was an accident, but Pike, in one move, had just twisted it into a weapon. The lie was so enormous, so complete, it took her breath away. He was using her, using the boy, using this terrible accident to fuel his hunt. Later that night, the camp was a hive of angry, frightened men. Clara sat in the corner of the main supply depot, a blanket around her shoulders. Manuel's mother had come, wordlessly, and applied a cool salve to her burns. The immigrant workers, the Mexicans, the Chinese, the few freed men, they looked at her differently. She had not saved a white child. She had saved their child. She had saved one of their own. A deputy ran into the depot, his face flushed with excitement. He went straight to Pike, who was conferring with Burke in the corner. Clara, hidden by stacks of crates, went unnoticed. "Sheriff, we found it," the deputy panted. "The scout. He found their camp. The main one. The whole family. In the canyon by the double mesas. Just like you said. They are holed up in there." Pike's smile was a terrible thing. Good work." Burke nodded once. "Finish it." "We ride at 4 o'clock, Pike said, his voice low but clear. "Before the sun, we will catch them in their blankets. I want every man with a rifle. Burke wants this finished." He pulled out a piece of paper, an official writ, and signed it with a flourish, an order for a dawn raid. Clara sat in the darkness. The cookhouse was gone. Her home, her job. The letter from Burke meant nothing now. What else could they take from her? She felt the small, hard shape of the medicine pouch in her apron pocket, safe from the fire. She felt the heavy, cold iron of the marked spike, which she had saved, tucked in her boot. The whole family, catch them in their blankets. This was not justice. This was not law. This was a massacre, built on the lies of thieves like Hutch and the ambition of men like Burke. She thought of Niall. She thought of his eyes, sharp with pain and surprise when she respected his medicine. She thought of his own gift to her, the herbs that smelled of the earth. She looked at the signed order in Pike's hand. She made her choice. She waited. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. The camp finally fell into a tense, exhausted quiet. The guards, jittery from the fire, watched the perimeter, not the center of the camp. Clara slipped out from behind the crates. She moved like a shadow, her burned hands aching, her body screaming for rest. She did not take a horse. She did not take food. She took the marked spike in the medicine pouch. She moved past the dark, silent tents, toward the path Niall had shown her. She ran, not toward the creek this time, but out into the cold, Vast darkness. Toward the double mesas. The desert at 3 o'clock in the morning was not empty. It was full of wind and stars and the smell of cold sage. Clara's heart ran. She was not a runner. She was a cook, built for hauling water and lifting iron pots, not for covering ground. Her lungs burned, and the thin soles of her shoes, the only pair she owned, slipped on the loose rock. The path Niall had shown her was not a path at all. It was a memory of a shadow, a line of slightly lower bushes, a dip in the terrain that only a man who had lived on this earth could read. She followed it from her own memory, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the burns on her hands and face, legacies of the cookhouse fire, stung in the sharp, dry air. She was running away from the iron and the canvas, the only safety she knew, toward a people who had every reason to see her as the enemy. The marked railroad spike in her pocket felt heavy, a cold piece of truth in a world built on lies. The stars were not comforting. They were hard, bright chips of ice in a black sky, and they offered no warmth, only a vast, indifferent light. A coyote yipped, far to the south, and she stumbled, nearly crying out. She was alone. She had left the camp, the guards, the sleeping men, and walked into the wilderness with a warning that might get her killed, either by the men she was warning or the men she had left behind. She found the canyon by the double mesas just as the sky began to bleed from black to a deep, bruised purple. She almost fell into it. She was sliding down a shale slope when a hand, hard as cured leather, clamped over her mouth and another arm locked around her waist, dragging her backward into the shadow of a boulder. She could not breathe. She fought, kicking, but the man was too strong. He held her against the rock until her struggling eased. "Why are you here?" The voice was low, and she recognized it. "Niall." The hand moved from her mouth. She sagged against the rock, panting, sucking in the cold air. A young Apache, not more than 16, stood nearby, holding a rifle leveled at her chest. "I came to warn you," Clara gasped, her voice raw. She looked at Niall. His face was granite in the pre-dawn light. His shoulder was still stiff, but he was alert. His eyes narrowed with profound suspicion. "Warn us," he repeated. It was not a question. It was a statement of disbelief. "Pike," she said, forcing the words out. "He rides. At 4 o'clock. His scout found this place. He signed the order." She fumbled in her pocket, but she had not taken the order. "He is coming, a large posse. He said he would catch you in your blankets. He is coming to kill everyone." The young man with the rifle said something in his own language, sharp and questioning. Niall did not answer. He stared at Clara, his gaze weighing her, searching for the trick. She was the camp. She was the enemy. She was the fire and the iron. A figure emerged from the deepest shadow, from a low and brush-covered shelter Clara had not seen. It was an old woman. She moved with the help of a stick, her body frail, but her presence filled the small clearing. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, and her eyes, even in the dim light, were bright and fiercely intelligent. This was Nalin. Nalin stopped a few feet from Clara. She did not look at Clara's face or her clothes. The old woman lifted her head, her nostrils flaring slightly, as if testing the wind. Clara smelled of her own sweat, of fear, and of something else. Nalin spoke, her voice like dry leaves. She spoke to Niall, but her eyes remained fixed on Clara. "This one. The smell of the kitchen smoke is on her, but it is the smoke that saves people. It is not the smoke that burns people." Niall's head snapped toward his grandmother, his expression full of confusion. Nalin pointed her chin at Clara. "The cookhouse fire," Nalin said, her English as slow and careful as Niall's. "She smells of the fire she walked into." Niall's gaze, sharp as his knife, moved over Clara. He saw her. truly saw her. He saw the singed edges of her hair. He saw the raw, red burns on her hands and up her arms. He saw the small, beaded medicine pouch he had left for her, which she still clutched in her left hand, safe from the flames. Nayland had not seen the fire, but she had read the story of it on Clara. She had recognized the smell of courage. "She speaks the truth," Nayland declared. Niol nodded. The granite of his face did not soften, but it changed. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a cold, swift purpose. The warning was accepted. He gave a sharp order. The canyon came alive, but not with panic. It was the smooth, practiced efficiency of a people who had done this before. 2 women emerged, gathering sleeping children. An older man began strapping packs to a pair of ponies. There was no wasted sound, no shouting. They were shadows detaching themselves from other shadows. Clara stood, useless, her body shaking from the run and the release of terror. She was a white woman, an outsider, a symbol of the very thing that was hunting them. A young woman, her face tight with anger, shoved a bundle into Clara's arms. It was a child, not more than 2 years old, wrapped in a thick rabbit fur blanket. "You," the woman said in broken English, "carry." Clara took the warm, sleeping weight. She held the child to her chest, the small body a profound, human anchor. She followed Nayland and the other women, climbing deeper into the canyon, then turning into a narrow fissure in the rock, a crack in the mesa that was invisible from below. They settled in a high, hidden alcove, a wide shelf of rock protected by an overhang. It was cold, and the children, now waking, began to cry softly. Neil and 3 other men had remained below. Clara could hear the faint sound of their movements, the brushing of branches, the soft scuff of moccasins on stone. They were not running, they were preparing. The people in the alcove were cold, their faces turned toward the canyon opening, waiting. Clara looked at their supplies. A few small sacks of dried corn, water skins, bundles of herbs. She was a cook. This, she knew. She moved to the back of the alcove, where a depression in the rock held the ashes of a previous fire. She looked at Nayland, who nodded once. The old woman pointed to a pile of dry, dead juniper, wood that would burn hot and with almost no smoke. Clara built the fire. She took the sack of corn. Using 2 flat stones, she began to grind it, her movements stiff and clumsy but purposeful. She added water from a skin, then pointed to the herbs. Nayland selected a few, the same ones Clara recognized from Niall's pouch, and added them to the bubbling pot. She made a thick, hot soup. She had no bowls. She used cupped pieces of bark. She served the old ones first, then the children. The act of serving, of sharing food, was a language that needed no translation. The crying stopped. The hot, nourishing meal, simple as it was, pushed back the cold and the fear. Niall returned just as the eastern sky turned a pale, sickly gray. He climbed the rocks as silently as a cat, his rifle in his hand. He saw Clara, her face smudged with soot and cornmeal, handing a piece of bark to the child she had carried. He sat, his back against the rock, and she brought a portion to him. He drank it. His eyes met hers over the rim. He did not say thank you. He just drank. He looked at his own shoulder. The cloth she had given him at the creek, bound tightly, was stiff with dried blood. He began to unwrap it. His movements pained. The wound beneath was an ugly, inflamed red. Clara put down the pot. She reached to the collar of her dress and unknotted the simple red neckerchief she wore. It was one of the few personal items she had saved, tucked into her apron when she fled the fire. It was singed along one edge, but it was clean. "You must keep it clean," she said, her voice low. "The fever will take you if you do not." She held the cloth out to him. He watched her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. He took the red cloth. She expected him to place it on the wound. Instead, his movements slow and deliberate. He wrapped the strip of red fabric, a bright, startling color in the gray dawn, around his right wrist. He tied the knot firmly. It was not a bandage. It was a mark, a symbol, a piece of her. Now, on him, a bright, visible link. "They come," he said. He moved to the edge of the alcove, peering down. As they waited, the sky growing lighter, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Pike is a fool, but he is a loud fool. The wind blows from the east. We will hear his horses before we see them." He made a small scratch in the dirt with his knife. "This is a shod horse. It slips on stone. You look for the white scratch." He made another mark. "Our pony grips. No scratch. You must learn to see the difference." He was repaying her warning with knowledge. He was teaching her to read his world, just as she had read the lies in hers. Then they heard it, the thunder of shod horses, slipping and sliding on the rock. Pike's posse, at least 20 men. They galloped into the canyon below, yelling, their voices echoing off the walls. They were a raw, violent intrusion in the quiet morning. "They are heading west," one of the Apache men whispered. "The trail," Neil said, a flicker of a grim smile on his face. "They follow the false trail." Pike and his men thundered past the hidden fissure, heading directly for a box canyon 2 miles to the west, a place Niall had called the Echo Valley. Then, a new sound, a rifle shot. But it did not come from the posse. It cracked from the ridge opposite their hiding place. A puff of white smoke rose. One of Pike's men shouted, his hat flying from his head. The posse instantly dissolved into chaos, men wheeling their horses, scattering, firing wildly at the rocks above them. "Is that your man?" Clara whispered, her heart leaping. Neil shook his head, his eyes narrowed, scanning the opposite ridge. "No." Another shot, and another. The posse was trapped in the canyon, the bullets pinging off the rocks around them. They were terrified. Clara squinted, her eyes straining in the morning light. She saw them, high on the ridge, tucked behind a stand of yucca. 2 men. They were not Apache. They were wearing boots and dusty canvas coats. "Hutch," she breathed, the name a bitter taste. "And Milo." She understood. It was them, the thieves. They were not just letting the Apache take the blame. They were proving it. They were firing on the posse, creating the Apache attack that Pike had wanted, cementing the lie, covering their own tracks with real bullets and real blood. Pike's men, believing they were in a full-scale ambush, did not stay to fight. They turned and fled, a panicked, disorganized retreat, galloping back toward the safety of the railroad camp. The canyon fell silent again. The sun was now up, and the victory felt thin and sick. Neil watched them go. They will be back. He was right. A scout returned to the camp later that morning. The news of the ambush spread like the fire that had taken Clara's kitchen. The camp was in a state of terror and rage. Niall's own scouts, who had shadowed the retreating posse, brought the final news. Silas Burke was furious. He had issued a new ultimatum. He did not care about the ambush. He wanted a culprit. He wanted the Apache leader responsible for the depot theft. He gave them 2 days. If a body was not produced, the surveyors, protected by a full company of riflemen, would begin marking the line, and they would mark it straight through the canyon, straight through the sacred burial grounds of Niall's ancestors. Neil looked at Clara. The sun was high now. The brief respite was over. "This is our home," he said, his voice flat. "Our graves. He will not have them." He touched the red cloth on his wrist. "You must go back, now, before they count the tents, before they know the cook is gone. You are in more danger than I am." He led her back down the fissure, down a steep, treacherous game trail she never could have found alone. The camp was visible below, a dirty sprawl of canvas and iron, a plume of black smoke rising from the engine. They moved fast, staying to the shadows. They were almost at the bottom. hidden in the last stand of creosote bushes at the edge of the camp. A shout. There, up on the ridge, look. It was not Pike. It was not a guard. It was a surveyor, perched on a high outcrop with a spyglass, his instrument glinting in the sun. He had a clear view of the trail. It is the Hart woman, the cook. She is with one of them. She is with an Apache. The alarm bell in the camp began to ring, a frantic, loud clanging that shattered the morning. Niol grabbed Clara's arm, yanking her back into the cover of the rocks. Men were already spilling from the tents, grabbing rifles. "Too late," Niol said, his voice low and hard. "You are with us now. Run." The word was a hard gust of air from Niol. The bell in the railroad camp below was a frantic, screaming metal voice, shouting their betrayal. He grabbed her hand, not gently, his fingers strong as iron, and pulled her from the game trail, back into the maze of high rocks. Shouts echoed up from the camp. "There up the ridge, it is her, the Hart woman. Get the horses." Niol did not look back. He ran, pulling her over stone, through thorny mesquite. He was not panicked. He was focused. He led her to a small, hidden cut in the earth where a single pony was tethered, patiently waiting. His. He vaulted onto its back and, in the same motion, reached down, locking his hand on her arm and hauling her up behind him. She barely had time to grip his waist before the pony leaped forward. They rode hard, the pony's hooves striking sparks on the rock. They were not making for the high, open ground. Niol was cutting west, toward a deep, sudden canyon, a jagged scar in the earth that Clara had only glimpsed from a distance. The shouts of the posse, now mounted and giving chase, grew louder, then softer, as Niol used the rolling terrain to mask their path. They reached the canyon rim. It was a 100-foot drop, sheer and impossible. Spanning it was a skeletal wooden bridge, a relic of some forgotten mining claim. Its timbers were silvered with age, and half the planks were missing. The pony skidded to a stop, whinnying, its eyes wide with terror. It would not cross. "He cannot cross," Niol said, his voice flat. He slid from the horse, pulling her down with him. Behind them, they could hear the posse closing in, the thunder of a dozen shod horses. "We leave him," Niol said. He slapped the pony's flank hard, sending it back the way they had come, a living, panicked diversion. "Now, run! Do not look down!" He grabbed her hand and pulled her onto the bridge. The structure groaned under their weight. The wind whistled up from the canyon floor. "There they are!" The voice was Pike's. He was close. "On the bridge, get them!" Clara heard the men dismount, their boots heavy on the rock. They were coming. She and Niol ran, their feet finding the few solid planks. The bridge swayed, a living, dying thing. A plank under Clara's foot, eaten through by termites, did not just crack, it crumbled into dust. She screamed, her foot plunging into nothing. Her momentum carried her forward and sideways, off the narrow walkway. She fell, her body slamming against the side of the bridge. She grabbed blindly, her fingers catching the splintered edge of a rotting support beam. She was dangling. 100 feet of empty air separated her from the rocks below. The wood cut into her palm, splintering. She could not hold on. Niol was 3 steps ahead. He had almost reached the other side. He spun, his face a mask. Pike and 3 of his men were on the bridge now, coming slow, their rifles up. Niol did not hesitate. He ran back. He ran toward the men, toward her. He lunged, ignoring the shouts, ignoring the danger. His hand locked around her wrist just as her own grip failed. He roared, a low, guttural sound of pure effort. He planted his feet, his muscles straining, and hauled her up. He dragged her over the broken edge, back onto the shuddering planks. He did not give her time to breathe. He shoved her. "Go!" They scrambled for the far side. A bullet whined past Clara's ear. striking the rock face. Pike and his men had stopped. They looked at the new gaping hole in the bridge, then at the sheer drop. They were not coming any further. Clara collapsed onto the solid rock of the far rim, gasping, her throat raw from her own scream. She was shaking violently. Neil stood over her, breathing hard, his good hand still locked on her wrist. They were cut off. They were safe. For the moment, they had trusted each other with their lives. They waited in the rocks until the posse, shouting curses, finally rode away. Clara's body ached. Her hands were raw. "Where do we go?" she whispered. "They will search everywhere." Neil looked back toward Laurel Creek. His eyes narrowed. "They will search the hills, the canyons. They look for me." He paused. "They do not look for you. In your own home." Clara's breath caught. My old home, the smithy." She looked at him, understanding dawning. "It is abandoned, on the far side of town, away from the camp. It has a cellar." "And," she thought, her heart quickening, "it has proof." They waited until dusk, a long, terrible day of hiding in the rocks. Before they moved, they circled wide, staying low, avoiding the skyline. They reached the edge of the sleeping town. The smithy stood dark, a hollow, sad place of memory. "Wait here," Clara whispered. She slipped inside, the familiar smell of cold iron, coal dust, and mice flooding her senses. It was a ghost of her former life. She went to the workbench where Robert had spent his last days. She knelt, her fingers finding the loose floorboard she had helped him install. She pried it up. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were two items, a dusty, leather-bound ledger, and a heavy, intricately carved steel die. She fumbled in her boot and pulled out the marked railroad spike. She held the heavy die to its head. The M inside the circle on the spike was a perfect mirror of the stamp. "This is it," she breathed, her voice shaking. She carried them to the doorway, where Niall stood watch. "This is the proof." They hid in the cold, dark cellar. Clara lit a single hoarded candle stub. She held the die in her trembling hand. "My husband, Robert," she said, her voice a dead, flat thing. "He made this. He was a blacksmith. He made these spikes for the bridge contract before Burke bought the line." Neil watched her, his face in the flickering shadow. He said nothing. "The company, Burke's company, they said he was careless." Clara continued, the words tasting like ash. "He died, a boiler explosion, but it was not an accident." She took a ragged breath, the truth she had held for a year finally breaking free. It was their equipment. It was old, rusted. He told them. He complained. They told him to be silent, or they would ruin him. He had debts from his father. She closed her eyes, the candle flame blurring behind her lids. "They killed him. They covered it up, called him careless, and I have been working in their greasy kitchen to pay them for the privilege." She opened her eyes, and they were hard, dry, and full of a cold fury Niall recognized. "I do not hate your people. Neil, I hate that. I hate the cruelty that grinds a good man to nothing and calls it business. I hate the lie." Niall was silent for a long time. The only sound was the scuttling of a mouse in the darkness. He touched the red cloth on his wrist. "My brother," he said, his English slow and heavy. "He was small. 10 winters." He looked away from her, at the stone wall. "Blue soldiers, before Burke. They said we stole cattle. They burned our village. My brother, he was afraid. He hid. He did not run." Niall's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white. "The fire! He did not come out!" He turned his gaze back to her, and his eyes were black with a memory she could now understand. "They make orphans, for cattle, for iron, for lies. I will not let them make more. The children in the canyon. They will not be orphans. not for Burke's lies. Their motives, born from different worlds, had found a common, bitter root. They were startled by a sound from the street above. Morning. A man's voice, loud and official. It was the town crier. Notice by order of Sheriff Tom Pike Bounty, $100 in gold for the woman. Clara Hart to be taken alive. $100 for aiding and abetting the Apache enemy. The world shrank to the size of the cellar. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She was an outlaw, a price on her head. Alive. They wanted her alive, to make an example of her. She looked at Niall. He was pale, his face beaded with sweat. He had hidden it, but the run, the fight on the bridge, the night in the cold, it had been too much. Niall. He slumped against the wall, his breath coming in hot, shallow gasps. She put her hand to his forehead. He was burning. Your shoulder, she whispered. She pulled back the buckskin. The wound, the one she had dressed at the creek, was not just red. It was swollen, angry, streaked with black. It was infected. We must move, she said, her own fear replaced by a new, cold urgency. They will search here. They will search everywhere. He was weak, leaning on her, his legs unsteady. She was the strong one now. She half dragged him from the smithy, back into the cover of the rocky hills they had just left. She found a cleft in the rock, a shallow cave, dry and hidden by a curtain of desert ivy. He collapsed onto the sandy floor. By nightfall, he was delirious. He was shaking violently, his teeth chattering, though his skin was fire. He muttered in his own language, his eyes seeing things that were not there. Clara was terrified. She was alone, in a cave, with a dying Apache, an outlaw, and it was her fault. She would not let him die. She remembered the small pouch, Nalen's gift, the herbs. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers closing around the soft leather. She pulled it out, the scent of pine and earth. She did not know how to use it. Her hands shook. She crushed the dried leaves and root between two stones. She mixed them with the last few drops of water from the canteen she had grabbed from the smithy. It made a thick, dark, pungent paste. She tore a strip from her underskirt, the last clean cloth she had. She cleaned the wound as best she could. It was ugly, seeping. He cried out in his delirium. I am sorry, she whispered. She packed the herbal paste into and around the wound. She bound it tightly. She sat with him all night. It was the longest night of her life. She held his hand, which was hot as a skillet. She poured single drops of water onto his cracked lips. Just before dawn, the violent shaking stopped. He became still, too still. Neo, she whispered, her voice cracking. Please. He opened his eyes. The fever was gone. They were clear. He looked at her, then at his shoulder. He saw the dark poultice. Nalen's medicine, he whispered. His voice was a rasp. I did not know what to do, she stammered, tears of relief and exhaustion blurring her vision. You knew. He said he was weak, but he was alive. They rested for another day. Hidden, healing. We have to, Clara said, her voice hard. She held the heavy steel die. We have to show them this, the spike, the ledger. We must prove it was Hutch and Milo, not your people. They will not listen, Neil said. He sat up, his strength slowly returning. Pike must listen, she insisted. He is a vain man, but he is not a fool. If we prove his own men are the thieves, that they shot at him, he cannot protect them. He will have to stop the raid on the graves. As they planned, they heard voices from the trail below the cave. Not a posse, 2 women from the town, gathering roots. Can you believe it? Mary, one voice said, sharp with gossip. The cook, Clara Hart, a spy for the savages. I know, the other replied. Elias said the surveyor saw her with him. clear as day. Leading them, Pike says she set that cookhouse fire herself. A signal to her savage lover. $100. Alive. I hope they catch her. It's not safe with her running free. The voices faded. Clara sat back in the shadow of the cave. The words landed like stones. The town, her community, the people she had fed, the Reverend, Elias. They had all tried and convicted her. She was a traitor. She was an enemy. She looked at Niall. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. He was the only person left in this desert who knew the truth. Her choice was made. There was no old community to return to. There was no cookhouse. There was no widow. Clara Hart. There was only the woman in the cave, and the man she had saved. The wind found them first. It began as a low moan through the high rocks, a sound that changed from a whisper to a complaint. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, turned a sickly yellow-brown. "Storm," Neil said. He was sitting up, his back against the cave wall, but his voice was still thin. The fever had broken, but it had left him weak as a newborn colt. "It will hide our tracks," Clara said, peering out from the cleft in the rock. The world was disappearing behind a curtain of yellow dust. "It will hide us," he corrected, his voice low, "and it will kill us." The temperature dropped, not in degrees, but in whole seasons. The sun, a pale wafer, vanished. The wind screamed, driving sand and ice-cold air into their shallow shelter. The curtain of desert ivy was ripped away in a single, violent gust. Clara shivered, her thin dress and apron offering no protection. She was cold, but she saw the tremor that seized Niall. It was not a shiver. It was a deep, bone-rattling shake. The fever had stolen his strength, and the cold was coming for him. "You are shaking," she said, her voice sharp with a new kind of fear. "The wind," he breathed, his teeth chattering. "It takes the heat." She looked around the bare stone cave. There was no wood, no brush, nothing to burn. They had only themselves and the few items they carried. Niall had his knife, his medicine pouch. She had the ledger, the heavy steel die, the marked spike, and, tucked in her apron pocket, the large wooden spoon she had saved from the fire. And he had the leather blanket, the leather robe. It was a single, heavy piece of cured hide, worn smooth with use, smelling faintly of sage and smoke. It lay folded by his side. He fumbled for it, his movements stiff. "You," he said, pushing it toward her. "You are cold." "And you are sick," she countered. "You will not last an hour. The fever will come back." He shook his head, a stubborn, proud movement. Clara felt a surge of impatience, a cook's practicality that had no time for foolish pride. "We will both die. That is not a good plan." She moved, kneeling beside him on the sandy floor. "Move over." He stared at her, his eyes wide in the gloom. The cultural divide, the gap between their worlds, was a physical thing in the small cave. She was the white woman, the enemy, the traitor. "Move!" she insisted, her voice leaving no room for argument. She was the woman who had run a kitchen, and she would run this cave. He shifted, his back sliding against the rock. She sat beside him, their shoulders and hips pressed together. She grabbed the heavy hide robe. It was stiff and cold, but it was thick. She unfolded it and pulled it over both of them, tucking it behind their backs, creating a tent of leather, a small pocket of shared space. The wind howled outside, a living, screaming thing, but inside their small shelter, the sound was muffled. The immediate, biting cold was blunted. She served in his kitchen by day. She had given him food, coffee, her neutrality, but unexpectedly ended up in the Apache's bed by fate. This was not a bed. It was a patch of sand on a stone floor. And this was not passion. It was a desperate, shared fight for life. He was still shaking. a violent, involuntary tremor that shook her. 2. "It is not enough," she whispered. She did not ask. She moved, shifting her body, pressing her side fully against his. She put her arm over his chest and pulled the robe tighter, anchoring it, sealing out the drafts. He went absolutely rigid. She could feel the muscles in his back and arm lock, hard as iron. He was a warrior. He was not used to this. "Be still," she murmured, as if calming a spooked horse. "It is just warmth. Let the shaking stop." He did not relax, not for a long time. They sat in the roaring darkness, two separate, rigid bodies under one blanket. She could feel his heart hammering against her arm. She was acutely aware of his smell, the earth and sweat, the sharp, clean scent of Nalin's herbs. He was aware of hers, the faint, lingering smell of soap and the ash from the fire. Slowly, the tremor in his body began to ease. The rigid line of his back softened. The cold was still there, a monster at the mouth of the cave, but the shared heat, held captive by the leather, was beginning to win. He let out a long, shuddering breath. It was the sound of surrender, not to her, but to necessity. He shifted, a small movement, turning his shoulders slightly, bringing his arm up to wrap around her waist, pulling her closer, not in affection, but in a purely practical move to eliminate the last pocket of cold air between them. Her head found the hollow of his shoulder. The wary distance was gone. There was only the roar of the wind, and the slow, steady beat of two hearts. She was no longer afraid of him. He was no longer suspicious of her. They had moved to simple protection. His arm, no longer holding her as a stranger, was now a barrier against the wind. Her hand, resting on his chest, was keeping the robe in place, protecting his weakened body. They sat that way for hours. The sandstorm raged, sealing them in a tomb of noise and cold. "Pike!" Clara whispered into the darkness, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "He wants to kill you. Burke wants to kill your people. But the men in the camp, Hutch and Milo, they are the criminals. They lied. They shot at their own posse." "My people," Neil's voice rumbled, his chest vibrating against her. "They are angry. They have the rifle. They want to kill Pike. They want to fight. And they will die," she said. "Pike's men have more guns. Burke has the railroad. It will be a massacre. A massacre you started. All for a lie." He was silent. He knew she was right. "When this storm ends," she said, her voice gaining a strength she did not know she possessed, "we have to stop them, not just Pike. We have to stop your people, too. We have to stop the war." "How?" "We find the truth, the real truth, not just the spike. I need Burke's books. I need to know why." She took a breath. "We have to protect the innocent. Not our honor, not our side. The children, your grandmother, the laundress, Manuel, even the Reverend." He was quiet for a long time, the only sound the wind. Then he nodded against her hair. "The innocent," he said, his voice a vow in the dark. "Before honor, that is the law." They did not sleep. They endured. As the first weak, gray light of dawn filtered through the dust, the wind began to die. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured, new and silent. They untangled themselves. It was awkward, the intimacy of the night exposed by the light of day. They sat apart, not looking at each other. The heavy hide robe pooled between them. The air was different. Their eyes were different. Clara pulled her apron from her pack, the wooden spoon, her last connection to her old life, fell out. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn grain of the handle. Neil watched her. He took his knife, the one she had returned to him, from his medicine pouch. He took a thin, strong sinew of deer leather. He did not ask. He held out his hand for the spoon. She gave it to him. He took it, with quick, precise movements. He wrapped the leather thong around the very top of the handle. He tied a knot, small, complex, and permanent. It was not a decoration. It was a mark. He had claimed the tool. He handed it back to her. "My knife," he said, touching its hilt. "It protects this." He touched the spoon. "It feeds. They are the same. A tool for life. This is ours now." She took it. She understood. It was a promise, a symbol of their new shared law. "The storm has cleared the air," he said, his voice stronger. He stood, his weakness fading, replaced by a cold resolve. "And it has cleared the tracks. They will be hunting," Clara said. "They will hunt me," Neil corrected. "They want the leader, the one the surveyor saw. They think you are with me, hiding, fleeing to the high country." "But I need to get into the camp," she said, her hand tightening on the spoon. "I need Burke's office. The spike and Robert's ledger are not enough. I need Burke's own books." A plan formed, unspoken, between them. "I will be the decoy," Neil said. "I will go east, toward the Echo Valley. I will leave a trail a blind man can follow. Pike, his deputies. They are proud. They will come for me. They will empty the camp to catch the great Apache leader." "It is a trap," she said, her voice sharp with fear. "You cannot fight them all." "I will not fight," he said. "I will run. I will give you the night. You go, get the book. Meet me at the smithy, Robert's smithy, before the sun. If I am not there, you do not wait. You take the books. You take them to the Reverend. You run." "Neil, no." "We protect the innocent," he said, his voice final. He touched the red cloth on his wrist, the one she had given him. "This is how." He was gone. He slipped from the cave and disappeared into the washed-out, rocky landscape. Clara waited until the sun was low. She heard the distant shouts, the frantic ringing of the camp bell. The decoy was working. The hunt was on. That night, she moved, a shadow against other shadows. Laurel Creek was a ghost town. Pike, Burke, and every man with a rifle had thundered out, following Neil's false trail. Only a few guards remained, and they were clustered around the saloon, nervous and loud. She reached Burke's office. It was a large tent, reinforced with timber, and it was locked. She did not go to the door. She went to the back, her knife in hand. She slit the canvas near the stovepipe, a trick she had seen Manuel use at the pantry. She was inside. The tent smelled of cold cigars, leather, and power. She lit no candle. She used the thin moonlight from the flap. She went to his desk. She found ledgers, shipping, payroll. And she found a locked metal box. She used the heavy, marked railroad spike, her husband's legacy. She jammed it into the lock and, with all her strength, pried the lid open with a groan of metal. Inside was not an account book. It was a contract, a secret one. She read it, her blood turning to ice. It was a silent partnership between Burke Rail and Mining and the Oro Fino Gold Company. The railroad was not just a railroad. It was a tool. The contract specified that the line would provide exclusive transport for the gold, and the attached assay map, marked with a red X, showed the richest vein. The X was directly over Neil's ancestral burial ground. Burke had manufactured the entire Apache War, the depot theft, the fire, the bounty. All of it was a lie, a smokescreen, to break the treaty, seize the land, and get to the gold. She heard a boot scuff outside the tent. She shoved the contract and the map under her dress. The tent flap opened. A lantern was raised. It was Hutch. He was drunk, his eyes unfocused. He had come to steal whiskey from Burke's private stash. "You!" he slurred, his brain slow to catch up. He saw the broken box. "The cook, the traitor, it was you!" He lunged for her. Clara did not scream. She grabbed the heavy desk inkwell and threw it. It struck him in the chest. showering him with black ink. He bellowed in surprise. She did not run for the door. She scrambled up a stack of crates, using her knife to slash a long, ragged cut in the canvas roof. She pushed her way through, out into the cold night air. She was on the roof, sliding down the canvas, her hand, the one holding the knife, caught on a sharp tin chimney brace. The metal edge sliced her palm, deep, from her wrist to her fingers. She gasped, a sharp, tearing pain. She landed on the ground, on her feet. She looked at her hand. It was pouring blood. She clutched it to her stomach, but it was useless. She ran. She left a dark, wet smear on the canvas wall, a trail of black drops in the moonlit dust. She ran, clutching the contract, toward the dark, silent promise of the smithy. She waited. She waited for hours, hidden in the cold cellar, her hand wrapped in the last strip of her apron. The bleeding had slowed, but her hand throbbed. He did not come. The sun began to rise. The sky turned gray. She heard it, not the alarm. A different bell, a loud, slow, triumphant ringing and shouting. She crept from the cellar. She hid in the alley. The whole camp was awake, gathering in the main square. They were cheering. She saw him. Neil. He was in the center of the square, tied to the main hitching post. His face was bruised, a cut over his eye. He was covered in dust. He had let them catch him. The diversion, he had sacrificed himself so she could get the proof. Sheriff Tom Pike stood on the saloon porch, his chest puffed out. "We got him," he roared to the crowd. "We got the leader, the murderer, the one who burned the cookhouse and led the attacks." He looked at Niall, his smile a predator's. "We will hold him right here. Let his people come. Let them see what we do to their savage chief. Let them come for him. We will be waiting." Clara leaned against the wall, the contract pressing against her skin. Neil's eyes, across the square, found her. He saw her, hidden in the shadow. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He was not just a decoy. He was bait, and the trap was set for his entire family. The town square of Laurel Creek was a stage, and Sheriff Tom Pike was its master of ceremonies. The morning sun was hot, beating down on the dust, and the entire population of the camp was gathered. They were a mix of sullen, angry railroad workers, frightened shopkeepers, and the silent, watchful immigrant families who did the camp's laundry and grunt work. Neil was the center of the spectacle. He was tied to the main hitching post, his hands bound tight. He was bruised from his capture, a long cut bleeding slowly over his left eye. But he stood straight. His gaze was not on the crowd. It was fixed on the hills, on the horizon, waiting. "Gather round, gather round!" Pike's voice was a booming, satisfied roar. He stood on the porch of the saloon, a tin cup of whiskey in his hand, a shotgun in the other. Silas Burke stood behind him, in the shadows, his arms folded, watching. "We are here today," Pike announced, "to see justice done." A few men in the crowd, deputies and foremen, cheered. Most were silent. "This savage," Pike pointed a thick finger at Neil, "is the leader of the hostiles, the one responsible for the depot raid, the one who burned the cookhouse, the one who led the ambush that shot at your very own posse." The crowd murmured, their fear and anger a low, ugly sound. "This is railroad property," Pike continued, his voice taking on a righteous tone. "And this is railroad law. We cannot wait for some fancy judge to ride in from Tucson. We must make our own justice." He turned to the two men he had summoned to stand beside him. "Is that not right? Reverend Miller, is that not right? Elijah?" The Reverend, his face pale and drawn, looked ill. Elias, the store owner, was visibly trembling. They were his unwilling jury, his props to make the lynching look like a trial. "Sheriff," the Reverend began, his voice weak, "this requires a trial. Evidence, witnesses." Evidence, Pike laughed. I have all the evidence I need, the word of my surveyor, who saw him with the traitor. Clara Hart, the ambush, the fire. What more do you need? What is the penalty for murder and treason? A voice from the crowd. One of Pike's deputies roared, "Hang him!" The cry was picked up. Hang him high. Pike smiled. A terrible, broad smile of victory. He raised his hand for silence. Then it is settled. We will hang him, and we will leave his body right here. As a message. Any of his kin come looking for him. They will get the same. He nodded to his deputies, who grabbed a heavy rope and tossed it over the high crossbeam of the saloon porch. Stop! The voice was not loud. It was clear, and it was female. It cut through the hate-filled air like a clean, cold knife. The crowd turned. A woman was walking from the alley between the smithy and the saloon. Her dress was torn and singed. Her hair, matted with dust, was half covered by a shawl. She held one hand clutched to her stomach, a bundle wrapped in a bloody apron. Pike's jaw dropped. Clara Hart. The crowd gasped. The traitor. She came back. It is her. Pike recovered, his face turning a deep, blotchy red. Well, the whore returns to her savage lover. You just saved me $100. Boys, seize her. Two deputies started forward, their hands reaching for her. Before you do, Clara said, her voice ringing with a strength no one had ever heard from her. You should ask your sheriff why he is lying to you. The deputies stopped. The crowd leaned in. Lying, Pike bellowed, his confidence faltering for a second. You dare. You said he, Clara pointed to Niall, burned the cookhouse. You said he led the depot raid. That is a lie. She strode forward, into the open, sun-baked square. She walked right up to the porch and, with her good hand, threw the contents of her bundle onto the dusty wooden planks at Pike's feet. A heavy marked railroad spike, a thick, leather-bound ledger. The objects landed with a solid, heavy thud. What is this trash? Pike kicked at the ledger. That, Clara said, pointing to the spike, is my husband's work. A bridge spike. You can see his mark. A B spike would not fit. A B spike, she said, her voice rising, is what was left in the depot. The spikes that were stolen were these. Pike looked confused. What nonsense is this? It is not nonsense. Clara pointed to the ledger. That is my husband's book. Open it, see the order signed by your own foreman. He bought those spikes, the ones he reported stolen. He signed for them, and then he sold them. A deep murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not a vague accusation. This was evidence. She is raving, Pike shouted. She is a traitor. She is trying to confuse you. Am I? Clara's gaze swept the crowd. She found him. Milo. He was at the back, his face white, trying to slip away. Ask him, she screamed, pointing. Ask Milo. He was on guard that night. He was with Hutch. Ask him where they took the supplies. Every eye in the square turned to Milo. He froze, trapped. Milo, Pike roared. Tell them she is lying. Milo looked at Pike. He looked at the angry, confused faces of the men he worked with. He looked at Clara, and his face crumpled. It is true, he sobbed, falling to his knees in the dust. It was not me. It was Hutch, Hutch said. He said Mr. Burke wanted an excuse. He said Pike knew. The square went utterly silent. He said Pike got a cut. Milo wept. $100, just to look the other way, to blame the Apache I never wanted. And then Hutch. He shot at us. He shot at the posse himself to make it look real. The silence broke. It was not a shout. It was a low, animal growl from the crowd. They had been played. They had been lied to. They had been used. He took my mule, a small, grizzled prospector said, his voice shaking with anger. Pike said it was company tax. My son, a large Irish Gandy dancer bellowed. The company doctor said he died of fever. He died because the company scaffolding was rotten. Burke knew. She saved my boy, Manuel's mother, the laundress, stepped forward, her eyes blazing. She stood beside Clara. She ran into the fire. This woman is not a traitor. This woman is the only one who told the truth. The crowd surged. Not toward Neil, not toward Clara. They surged toward the porch, the immigrant workers, the miners, the families. They were a single, furious body. Reverend Miller, his face transformed with a righteous fury, stepped off the porch and stood next to Clara. The sheriff has lied. The company has lied. I will not stand with them. I stand with the truth. Pike was trapped. His deputies were backing away, their eyes on the mob. Burke had not moved. He stood in the shadow of the doorway, his face pale, his eyes cold. He lifted one hand, just one finger, and pointed toward the roof of the dry goods store across the square. A single sharp crack of a high-powered rifle split the air. The crowd screamed. Neil grunted, his body lurching against the post. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, tearing a long, burning graze along his ribs and splintering the wood he was tied to. The crowd exploded into chaos. People ran, screaming, diving for cover. Clara did not run. She ran to him. She launched herself at the post, throwing her body in front of Neil's, shielding him. "No!" she screamed, her bloody hand pressed flat against the wood. "You cannot, he is the witness." Hutch, on the roof, ejected the cartridge and reloaded. He had a clear shot at her back. In the chaos, Pike saw his chance. He drew his pistol and grabbed the closest person, Elias, the store owner, who was frozen in terror. Pike jammed the barrel of the pistol under Elias's chin. "Back off," Pike screamed, dragging his hostage. "All of you, back off, or I will blow his head from his shoulders." The square was a frozen standoff. Pike had his hostage. Hutch had his rifle. Clara was a target. A figure stepped from the alley beside the dry goods store. It was Nalin. She was alone. She looked up at the roof. Hutch saw her, a crazy old woman. He ignored her, settling his aim on Clara's back. Nalin held a small pouch in her hand, with a quick, practiced motion. She flung the contents into the air. A cloud of fine, white powder, sacred cornmeal, flew upward. The wind caught it. It hit Hutch's face just as he squeezed the trigger. He roared, blinded, firing wild. The bullet shattered the big mirror behind the saloon bar. In that same instant, Neil, seeing his chance, tore against his bonds. The splintered post cracked. He lunged, his body low, his hands still tied, hitting Pike square in the chest. Pike went down. The pistol flew from his hand. Elias scrambled away, sobbing. Niall was on him. He rolled, grabbing his own knife, which Pike had tucked in his belt. He raised the blade, the sun glinting on the steel. The crowd held its breath. He looked at Pike's terrified, blubbering face. He saw Clara, watching him, her eyes wide. He saw Nalin, standing calm, across the square. He flipped the knife in his hand. He brought the heavy bone pommel down on Pike's temple. A single, dull, heavy sound. Pike went limp. Neil did not kill him. He found the rope that had been meant for his own neck and, with swift, efficient movements, tied the sheriff's hands behind his back. The crowd roared. A sound of approval. A victory! Hutch was scrambling down from the roof, rubbing his eyes, only to be met by the Irish Gandy dancer and 3 miners. They swallowed him in a sea of fists. Clara ran to Niall. She cut his bonds with his own knife. "Are you hurt?" "Flesh," he grunted, pulling a long, sharp splinter from his side. "The bullet is not in me." They stood, breathing hard, in the center of the victorious, chaotic square. Clara looked for the true enemy. Burke. He was gone. Where is he?" she yelled. The station master, who had hidden behind the water trough, pointed, his hand shaking. "The tracks he got on his horse. He is riding west toward the new bridge. He is riding for the construction line." Clara's blood ran cold. The bridge, the burial ground, the gold. She looked at Niall. He grabbed Pike's fallen pistol. She grabbed her ledger. A high, shrill whistle cut through the air. It was the construction engine, its steam whistle screaming. "He is not running away?" Clara whispered, her voice full of a new, cold horror. "He is going to finish it. The graves. He is going to blow the bridge, and the burial ground with it." The new bridge was a raw skeleton of pine and iron, stretching west over the dry Arroyo Seco. Beyond it, on the far bank, the land rose in a gentle slope, the land marked by the small, discreet stone piles of the Apache burial ground. Silas Burke was standing in the center of the bridge. He was not alone. Flanking him were 2 kegs of black powder. A long, black fuse snaked from them, disappearing under the tracks. He held a detonator box, his hand resting on the plunger. He was no longer the calm, clean man from the office. His suit was torn, his face slick with sweat. He was a cornered animal. "That is far enough," Burke shouted. His voice was thin against the rising wind, which moaned through the bridge's framework. Clara and Neil stopped at the eastern edge. Behind them, the town was coming. Not a mob, but a procession. Reverend Miller, the Irish Gandhi dancer, Manuel's mother, Nalin. They stopped 100 yards back, a silent, watching jury. "You are finished, Burke," Clara yelled, her voice hoarse. "We have the contract. We have Milo. The town knows you lied." "The town knows nothing," Burke screamed back, his voice cracking. "I am this town. I brought the iron. I brought the wages, and I will not be stopped by a whore and a savage." "So you will destroy it all?" she called out. "The bridge, the evidence, the graves." "This bridge is my property," he shrieked. "That land," he gestured to the burial ground, "is my gold. I will level it. I will send it all to hell. I will erase the graves, and I will erase the contract." Clara and Niall exchanged a single, hard glance. The plan was forged in that look. Neil did not move toward Burke. He slipped backward, off the track bed, and vanished. He dropped into the shadows of the ravine, silent as the wind. Clara took a step forward, onto the bridge. Her bloody, bandaged hand was hidden in her apron. Her good hand clutched the heavy steel die, her husband's mark. "You are a fool to come alone," Burke sneered, his hand tightening on the plunger. "I am not alone," Clara said, her voice quiet. I brought my husband with me." She took another step. The wind whipped her hair across her face. "You remember Robert Hart, do you not, Mr. Burke?" Burke's face twitched. "He was a blacksmith, a drunk. He was careless." "He was careful," Clara said, her voice shaking, but not with fear, with rage. "He was a master craftsman. He was the one who found the error in your books. He knew you were faking the payroll. Long before the gold, he knew you were cheating the company you worked for." Burke laughed, a short, ugly bark. "He knew nothing. He was an ant, an expense. He complained about a boiler, so I removed the expense." Behind her, on the ridge, Clara heard the Reverend's sharp intake of breath. "We hear you, Mr. Burke." The Reverend shouted, "We are all witnesses." Burke's head snapped up. He saw the crowd, watching, listening. His trap was sprung. His arrogance had damned him. "You hear nothing?" he roared, his face purple. "You are all insects. You live because I allow it." He looked back at Clara. "He died, and you will die. But first, you will watch me finish this." He pulled a match from his pocket and struck it on the rail. He touched the flame to a secondary fuse, a backup, that snaked toward the kegs. "Even if I do not push the plunger, It all goes 5 minutes. The fuse caught, sparkling, sizzling, a black line of fire eating its way toward the powder. Clara watched it. She saw the sulfur, the charcoal. It was just black powder. She knew black powder. It was the same as the saltpeter she used for curing bacon, the same as the charcoal in her stove. She knew what it needed, and she knew what it hated. It hated being smothered. While Burke's eyes were on the crowd, gloating, Clara dropped to her knees. She did not run. She did not scream. She began grabbing handfuls of the heavy, gritty ballast from between the ties, the rock and sand. "What are you doing?" Burke yelled, confused. She lunged, not at him, but at the fuse. She dumped the ballast onto the sizzling line, smothering it. The spark died. She scooped and dumped, again and again, breaking the chain of fire. "No!" Burke screamed. He saw his backup plan failing. He raised his hand and brought it down, hard, on the detonator. He brought it down on empty air. Niol's hand shot up from beneath the bridge ties, his fingers locking around Burke's wrist, centimeters before it hit the plunger. With a powerful, inhuman grunt, Neil hauled himself up onto the bridge, his other hand gripping the hilt of his knife. He looked like a spirit of vengeance rising from the earth. Burke, screaming in terror, wrestled with him. He was a strong man, but Niall was a warrior. Neil slammed his elbow into Burke's face, breaking his nose. Burke stumbled back, his hand slipping from the detonator. He stumbled directly into a second, smaller charge, a wire-tripped mine Clara had not seen, set to protect the kegs. Burke's foot hit the wire. The explosion was not large, but it was violent. It was not the main charge. It was a single stick of dynamite, just enough to break the bridge's spine. The timbers shrieked. The metal rail twisted. The section of the bridge where Burke stood, and where Clara was, buckled. Burke was thrown backward, collapsing onto the stable part of the track. Clara was thrown forward. The ties beneath her feet fell away, plunging into the ravine below. She cried out, her body falling into the void. She did not fall far. Her good hand shot out, her fingers catching the twisted, hot steel of the broken rail. She was dangling. It was the bridge from her nightmare, the rotted wooden span. She was dangling over the abyss again, her feet kicking at nothing. Niol saw her. He was on the stable section of the bridge. Burke was groaning at his feet, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The crowd on the ridge screamed. Neil did not hesitate. He ran onto the groaning, unstable wreckage. The bridge swayed under his weight. "Clara!" He lunged, sliding on the splintered wood. His hand outstretched. He was too far. The rail she was holding was groaning, pulling free from the spikes. He tore the long leather thong from his belt, the one that held his sheath. He snapped it. A whip of leather. "Clara, grab it." She looked up, her face pale. Her bloody, bandaged hand was useless. She let go with her good hand, a terrible, split-second act of faith, and grabbed the leather thong. Her weight almost pulled him over. He dug his heels into the ties, his muscles straining, the old wound in his shoulder screaming in protest. He leaned back, his whole body a lever, and pulled. He dragged her, scraping up the side of the wreckage. He pulled her over the edge, onto the shaking planks, just as the rail she had been holding tore free and crashed into the canyon, 100 feet below. He pulled her into his arms. They clung to each other, gasping, their hearts hammering, balanced on the skeleton of the broken bridge. Burke was trying to crawl away. His leg was trapped, pinned under a heavy, displaced timber from the explosion. He was whimpering, his arrogance shattered, replaced by the terrified face of a trapped animal. Neil stood. He walked over to the trapped man. He held the pistol he had taken from Pike. He raised it, pointing it at Burke's head. "Go on," Burke spat, his voice thick with blood and hate. "Do it! Be the savage! Prove me right! Kill me!" Neil looked at the pathetic man. He looked at Clara, watching him, her eyes wide. He looked at the crowd, now carefully making their way down the ridge. He lowered the pistol. He looked at the Irish Gandhi dancer, the man who had lost his son. "He is not my justice," Niall said. "He is yours." He jammed the pistol into his belt. He bent down, not to kill Burke, but to help him. He put his good shoulder under the heavy timber and, with a deep groan of effort, lifted it, freeing Burke's leg. Burke cried out in pain. Niall grabbed the front of his torn, expensive coat. He did not kill him. He did not abandon him. He dragged the company owner back across the stable part of the bridge and threw him onto the solid ground at the feet of the Reverend. "We have him," the Gandhi dancer said, his voice thick. He and 2 other miners took Burke, binding his hands. The confrontation was over. The bridge was broken. The graves were safe. Niall turned. He looked at Clara. He smiled, a small, tired smile. Then he stumbled. "Niall." He put his hand to his shoulder. The red cloth, her cloth, was soaked. It was black with fresh blood. The effort of lifting the timber, of pulling her to safety, had been too much. His old wound, the bullet graze from Pike's ambush, had torn wide open. He fell to his knees. He did not collapse. He crawled, his last few feet, to the edge of the burial ground. He reached out and found a small, smooth, white stone, a piece of quartz. He placed it carefully on the edge of the sacred land, a promise kept. Then his strength left him. He fell onto his side, his eyes closing, the red stain spreading in the dust. Clara screamed his name. She ran to him, sliding to her knees. He was pale, his breathing shallow. He was bleeding out. She tore at the cloth. The wound was deep, gaping, worse than before. She fumbled in her apron pocket. Her hand, cut and bloody, closed around the small, soft pouch, Nayland's medicine. She tore it open, pouring the last of the precious, dark herbs into her own bloody palm. She looked up. Nayland was there, at the edge of the ridge, watching. The old woman nodded once. Clara pressed her hand, her blood, and the herbs directly into the wound, packing it hard, just as she had done with the cloth at the creek. "No," she whispered, her tears falling onto his face. "You will not. I will not let you." She applied the pressure, the circle of care complete. She had saved him with his own medicine. The railroad was stopped. The line was broken. The crowd stood in the sudden, profound silence, looking at the captured owner, the bound sheriff back in town, and the broken bridge that led to nowhere. The Iron Snake was dead. The town of Laurel Creek, for the first time, was on its own. It had to choose a new path. The silence that fell over the ravine was heavier than the iron of the rails. The wind, which had howled over the bridge, seemed to die, leaving only the sound of Clara's ragged breathing and the low, pained groans of the man she held. Niall was unconscious. His body was limp, his face a pale gray beneath his skin. Clara held her bloody hand, mixed with Nayland's herbs, hard against his shoulder, a desperate, futile plug against the life leaving him. The crowd from the town approached, no longer a mob, but a collection of stunned, silent individuals. They saw Niall, not as a savage, but as the man who had disarmed the tyrant and saved the traitor. They saw Clara, not as a traitor, but as the woman shielding him. Nayland was the first to reach them. She did not rush. The old woman walked with a steady calm, her eyes taking in the scene. She knelt beside Clara, her gaze falling on the wound, then on Clara's own bleeding hand, which was pressing the medicine into her grandson. Nayland's face was unreadable. She looked at Clara's eyes, saw the terror and the desperate resolve. The old woman nodded once. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of acceptance. She placed her own thin, wrinkled hand over Clara's, adding her strength to the pressure. The Irish Gandy dancer, the one who had lost his son, spat on the ground. "Reverend, let us get this filth." He nudged Burke's groaning form. "Back to the jail. What is left of it?" Two miners, their faces grim, lifted Burke by his arms, his broken leg dragging uselessly. He cried out, a thin, weak sound. They had no sympathy. They began the long, slow march back to Laurel Creek, a procession carrying the broken symbol of their oppression. Reverend Miller directed the making of a litter. 4 men, 2 from the railroad and 2 of Neil's kin who had arrived with Nalin, cut saplings. They gently lifted Neil onto the canvas. Clara did not let go of his hand. She walked beside the litter, her own cut, which she had forgotten, dripping a steady, dark line in the dust. They did not take Niall to the jail. They did not leave him in the square. The Reverend led them to the small, clean room behind the church, the rectory where he slept. They laid Neil on the Reverend's own cot. It was the only real mattress in Laurel Creek. For 3 days, the town held its breath. The railroad was silent. The hammers were still. The engine sat cold on the tracks. The legal consequences were swift. Now that the engine of fear was broken, Sheriff Tom Pike, nursing a spectacular headache, was bound hand and foot in his own jail cell, the one he had built for Neil. Milo and Hutch, beaten and sobered, were thrown in with him. They confessed immediately, their stories tumbling out in a pathetic cascade of blame and terror. They signed a full confession, implicating the foreman. The foreman, in turn, produced his own hidden ledger, proving Burke had been cooking the books for months, planning to seize the gold mine long before the depot theft. The new town council, led by Elias and the Reverend, sent a rider, the fastest in the camp, toward Tucson. He carried the ledgers, the contract, the confessions, and a formal request for a territorial marshal. Silas Burke, his legs set in crude splints, was kept under heavy guard, awaiting a federal trial, not the railroad law he had created. The social structure of Laurel Creek changed like the weather. The power was no longer in the railroad office. It was in the town square. The council's first act was a decree, written by the Reverend and signed by Elias, the Irish Gandy dancer, and a dozen other miners and merchants. It declared the land of the Double Mesas, including the burial ground, as protected territory under the town's own law, pending a formal treaty. Their second act was to form a new town watch, the Gandy Dancer, a quiet Mexican man named Hector who was the fastest draw in the camp, and one of Niall's younger cousins were deputized by the council. They were not company men. They were the town's men. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Clara had not left Niall's side. She had slept in a chair, waking every hour to check his breathing, to clean the wound. Nayland had come and gone, bringing fresh herbs. But she had let Clara do the work. She had recognized the right of the woman who had fought for him. He woke, his eyes clear. He saw her, asleep in the chair, her head on her arms. He saw her bandaged hand. The Reverend, using a clean needle and gut thread, had stitched the deep gash in her palm. Clara stirred, her head snapping up. She saw him watching her. A great, shuddering breath escaped her, a sound that was half a sob, half a laugh. "You are back," she whispered. "You stayed," he replied, his voice a dry rasp. The small room was quiet, an island of peace in the changed world. Clara rose and brought him a cup of water. He drank. She sat on the edge of the cot, her body aching with exhaustion. "It is over," she said. "No," he said, shifting, the pain in his shoulder still sharp. "It is changed." She looked at her own hands. One was stained with her work, the other scarred by her fight. "The women in the town," she said, her voice dropping. "They do not speak to me. When I go for water, they turn away. They still whisper, 'The traitor, the savage's woman.'" She looked up, her eyes meeting his, the truth of her heart finally laid bare. "And your people, Nalin, She is kind. But the others, they look at me. I am the white woman. I am the railroad. I am the one who brought this." Her composure, held for so long, finally cracked. I think I love you, Neil. I think I have since you gave me the herbs for my burn. But there is no place for me. I do not belong to them, and I do not belong to you. I am a ghost, a rumor." Neil was silent for a long time. He watched her, seeing the fear beneath the strength. He reached out, his good hand, and gently took her bandaged one. He traced the line of the stitches with his thumb. "They call me Chief," he said, his voice low. "I am not a chief. I am a hunter. They called me a murderer. I am not a murderer. They called you a traitor. You are not a traitor." He turned her hand over, looking at the rough, calloused palm of a worker, now marked by a warrior's scar. "They make words, rumors, smoke. They build cages from these words." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers, pulling her in. "We do not belong to the rumors. Clara, we belong to the truth. We belong to the innocent we saved. That is our place. It is a new place. We will build it." The door opened softly. Naylin entered. She carried a small clay bowl of hot corn soup. She looked at Niall, then at Clara. Seeing their hands joined, she said nothing. She gave the soup to Niall, who drank. Then the old woman turned to Clara. She reached into the pouch at her belt. She held out her hand. In her dry, wrinkled palm lay a thin leather thong. On it was a single, small, smooth piece of bone, polished white as ivory. It was simple, and it was beautiful. Clara looked at it, her eyes asking the question. "For the firewalker," Naylin said, her voice soft. "You saved the child. You saved the man. You saved the graves." She lifted the thong. "You have the hands of a woman who builds, not one who takes, the hands of a mother." Naylin placed the necklace over Clara's head. The small, cool piece of ivory settled in the hollow of her throat. It was not a grand ceremony. It was not a formal adoption into the tribe. It was something more simple and more profound. It was an invitation. It was a sign. "We see you. You are one of us." A week later, Neil was strong enough to walk. The new town kitchen was finished. It was built on the ashes of the old cookhouse, but it was not a company mess. It was the town's kitchen, attached to the side of the church. The Reverend had called it a charity, but it was simply a place where everyone, Apache, Mexican, Irish, and Swede, could get a hot meal. Clara found herself drawn to it, the familiar heat of a stove, the smell of baking cornbread. She began organizing it, her cook's instincts taking over. No one questioned her. They just helped. One morning, just after dawn, she and Naol walked to the creek. It was their place. The cottonwoods were catching the new light. The air was clean. Naol still wore the red neckerchief tied to his wrist. It was caked with dirt and the dark, dried blood from the bridge fight. It was a symbol of their shared battle. Clara knelt by the water. She gently untied the knot. He let her. She held the stiff, stained cloth in her hands. She dipped it into the clear, cold, running water. She watched as the stream carried the blood away, the dark cloud of their fight dissolving into the current. The fabric, when she lifted it, was clean. The red was bright, vibrant, the color of life, not death. She wrung it out, folded it carefully, and tucked the damp square into her apron pocket. The evidence was gone. The keepsake remained. When they returned to the new kitchen, a small figure was waiting by the door. It was Manuel. He was not hiding in the shadows. He was not afraid. He ran to Clara. He was holding 3 small ears of young, green corn, clutched in his fists. "Para la sopa, señorita," he said, his voice bright and clear. "For the soup." He pressed the corn into her hands. gave her a wide, gap-toothed smile, and ran off to play with the other children, Apache and Irish, in the dust of the main square. Clara looked at the corn, the gift of a new generation, one that was not afraid. That evening, the Reverend Miller tacked a new notice to the community board. The territorial marshal had sent word. He would arrive in 2 weeks, but the railroad company was sending a representative, an agent, to discuss the future of the line. The new council called a town meeting for the following night. The question was simple. What now? The Iron Snake was not dead. It was just sleeping. The Reverend found Clara and Neil sitting by the new stove, sharing a bowl of the soup Manuel's corn had gone into. "The town will meet tomorrow," the Reverend said, his face serious. "We have to decide what we want, what we will demand. The company will try to divide us again, but this time, we are not divided." He looked at them, the Apache warrior and the railroad cook, sitting together. "The council has asked that you both speak. They will listen to you. We all will." The town meeting was held in the open square, under the hard, bright stars. There was no saloon porch to stand on, no sheriff's office to represent the law. There was only the center of the dust and a single lantern on a post. The new company agent, a nervous man in a clean suit who had arrived that afternoon, stood on one side. The town council, Niall, Nalin, and Clara, stood on the other. The agent, Mr. Hayes, spoke first. His voice was smooth, reasonable. "The Burke Rail and Mining Company," he began, "is appalled by the illegal and violent actions of Mr. Burke and his associates. They will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The company wishes to restore normal operations as soon as possible. We are prepared to offer a bonus, a 10% wage increase for all laborers, to get the line moving again." He smiled, a thin, practiced smile. "We are all partners in progress." The crowd was silent. The old, easy promises no longer worked. The Irish Gandhi dancer, the one who had lost his son, stepped forward. "We have been partners with your progress before, mister. It cost my boy his life. It cost this town its soul." He looked at the council. "We have our own terms." Reverend Miller stepped forward, a single sheet of paper in his hand. "We have a resolution," he announced, his voice ringing with a new, hard-won authority. "First," he said, "the railroad will not cross the burial grounds. The line will be rerouted 5 miles to the south around the double mesas. That land is sacred, and it is not for sale." The agent sputtered, "5 miles, the cost, the delay, it is impossible." "It is not." Clara's voice cut through the dark. She stood beside Niall. "We have seen your contract, the gold map. You have been lying about your route from the beginning. You will pay for the reroute with the gold you were trying to steal." The agent's face went pale. He knew he was beaten on that point. "Second," the Reverend continued, "the company will sign a fair labor contract, not with a foreman, but with the town council. Fair wages, inspected equipment, and a proper doctor, paid for by the company, not by the men's wages." "And third," Clara said, stepping fully into the lantern light, the ivory at her throat gleaming. "The kitchen, it is no longer a company mess. It is the Laurel Creek kitchen. It will feed the laborers. Yes, but it will be run by the town. Its supplies will be bought from all people, including the Apache, at a fair price. The books will be open, posted on the church door every week. No more secret ledgers, no more debt." The agent looked at the faces in the crowd, the miners, the immigrants, the Apache, the merchants. They were a single, solid wall. They were not asking, they were telling. "This is highly irregular." Hayes stammered. "This is the new law," Neil said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner. He stood beside Clara, his hand resting near the red cloth on his wrist. "You will sign, or your Iron Snake will stay broken, and your gold will stay in the earth." The agent, trapped, looked at the crowd, at the new deputies, at the unyielding faces. He nodded. A single, sharp, defeated movement. "I will send a wire to the board." The meeting was over. The town had won. Later that night, the real ceremony took place. It was not in the church. It was not in the square. It was in the canyon, by the new, shared fire, built in the clean ashes of the old one. Nalin was there. The Reverend was there. The Gandhi dancer. Elias and Manuel's mother were there. The children, Apache in town, sat wrapped in blankets, their faces bright in the firelight. Niall did not stand apart as a warrior. He stayed seated, tending the fire. Clara did not serve. She sat beside him, her hands resting in her lap. There were no vows. There were no rings. Nalin, the old woman, spoke. "The white man's law," she said, her voice like the dry rustle of leaves, "is paper. It can burn. The people's law is the earth. It holds us. And the family law, it is the fire. It warms us. Tonight we make a family law." Clara reached into her apron and took out the wooden spoon, the one with the leather thong Niall had tied to its handle. She held it out, her bandaged, scarred hand steady. Neil placed his hand over hers, his fingers covering the wood, his thumb resting on her stitches. "You are the kitchen," he said to her, his voice soft, for her alone. "You are the center, the place we all return to. I will not leave the mountains. They are my heart." "And I will not leave the fire," she replied, her voice just as low. "It is my truth. Your path is the wild, mine is the hearth, but they will run side by side. We will be free, but we will not be alone." They held hands over the spoon. They looked at the fire, at the elders, at the children. It was a promise, not of forever, but of now, a promise to build, together. The days that followed found a new rhythm. It was not the relentless, metallic pulse of the railroad. It was the rhythm of a town rebuilding itself. The sound of hammers returned, but it was not the sound of spikes being driven. It was the sound of new houses, of a real schoolhouse being built, of the jail being reinforced, and, in the distance, muffled and far to the south, the sound of the new line being laid. The iron snake now tamed, forced to bend to the will of the land and its people. Life settled. Clara, her hand healed to a pale, silver scar, ran the kitchen. It was a place of loud, chaotic joy. She found herself teaching. She taught the Irish Gandhi dancer's daughter how to bake bread that would always rise. She taught the Apache children, who came down from the hills with Neil, how to make a rich stew from beans and the herbs Nalin provided. And Neil, in turn, found himself teaching. He took Manuel and the Gandhi dancer's youngest son up into the hills. He did not teach them to hunt. He taught them to see. He showed them the track of a shod horse and the track of a pony. He showed them which plants healed and which to avoid. He taught them the new language of their shared earth. The symbols of their old lives found their new, proper places. The kitchen fire, once a symbol of Clara's servitude, was now the heart of the community, a place of sustenance and fairness, the burial ground. Once a symbol of Burke's greed and a place of fear, was now a protected, respected memorial, a line that could not be crossed, the town's moral boundary. And the railroad, once a symbol of tyranny, was now just a tool. It ran far away, a distant whistle on the wind. It was a road, not a master. It was a way to move, to remember, but it no longer lived. The true life was here, in the kitchen, in the canyon, in the dust of the town square. The future was not a promise of ease. The coming rainy season, the men knew, would be hard. The ravine would flood. The new track would be slow to build. But it was a future they had chosen. They had their own law, their own council, their own food. They had a shared map, drawn from their own hands, paid for in their own blood. It was not a fairy tale. It was not a magical ending. It was a hard, realistic hope. It was the kind of hope that did not fall from the sky. It was the kind of hope that was built, spike by spike, loaf by loaf, word by word. It was a hope that grew from the good, dark earth tended by human hands. On the last day of that long, dry season, Clara stood outside the new kitchen. The evening wind blew from the west, from the mesas. It carried the scent of sage and pine from the high country, from the town. It carried the smell of her cornbread, a rich, warm promise. The two scents, wild and domestic, met and mingled in the air. In the far, far distance, faint as a memory, she heard the tap-tap-tap of a hammer, a new road, a different path. The smoke from her chimney rose, a white plume against the deep blue sky, and joined the wind, heading for the hills. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please let us know in the comments, and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and like this video. It helps us a great deal. And if you enjoyed this journey, please hit that hype button so this story can be heard by many more.